Hello, everyone. Welcome to New Polities Podcast. We are preparing for our conference, our 2025 conference, Our Kind of People, where we are discussing what it means to be a people and whether that's destroyed by being a nation or not. That's particularly our discussion today. We're so excited for you guys to come to Steubenville. May 29th through 31st are the dates of the conference. And these podcasts are really supposed to sort of prepare us to start thinking along these lines. There's a certain language of social Catholicism that was big in the 20th century for obvious reasons. And we seem doomed to repeat the errors and arguments of the 20th century. Sometimes, I don't know how you feel, sometimes I feel like I'm arguing with Nazis as if they're like a present concern. It's like, well,
right. They're behind the door.
This is why the eugenics movement is... But here we are, doomed to repeat the past. And so as Catholics, we are swinging for our team as best we can. I'm here with Alex Denley.
Hello.
Alex, great to see you. And today we are discussing a little book by Ernest Renan, who is, first of all, he's a good-looking guy. You should look him up on Wikipedia. He's just got a real Frenchman look.
Yeah.
And I think I can respect that. He's sort of famous and infamous in different ways. So he has a defense of colonialism that I would say is a little bit disgusting. He has a Life of Jesus that was very popular, that is notably secularizing in many ways. He's a quintessential sort of bourgeois mind in some ways. You read him, and he sounds just extremely nice and pleasant, and he just wants everyone to get along. But as nations, in his particular work that we're reading today and that we're going to share with you guys as part of our preparation for the just profound discussions that are going to happen in Steubenville on May 29th through 31st, this text, What is a Nation? He really tackles the question. Mm-hmm. And he asks at a time, so late 19th century, he asks at a time in which the nation is beginning to be established as the unit. In fact, it already is, post-French Revolution and all that, obviously, is already established as the unit for human grouping that characterizes Europe, that comes out of the Christian order, which is essentially fallen. So there's no relationship of the nations to the one church anymore, but each are dealing with in their own way the results of a theory of sovereignty by which nations have a sort of a priori existence. They're just our nations. Mm-hmm. And so this really becomes a question of philosophy now because it's already been achieved in fact through warfare and through reformation in the church.
Right, in such a way that we can use people and nation interchangeably. And that's actually going to be the subject of his discussion here, mm-hmm. that those are actually two different realities, social realities of people and nation. And they're not the same thing.
And the church, if you read, I don't know if any of you guys have this copy of the Compendium of Social Doctrine that the bishops put out, or it's the Vatican put out. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't have a lot on the people, and it frustrates me. I hereby officially offer New Polity to the Pope and whoever's in charge of that particular work, that if you would like us to take the results of our conference and of our thought here and reduce them into a well-ordered and numbered list of sentences on the people, I think we could help the compendium. Yeah. We're full of an awareness here. I don't know how you guys feel where you're from. Illinois, where are you from? We're full of an awareness of being the church, increasingly. Mm-hmm. And so just as such, I'm ready to contribute to a church document. I want everyone to know this. Yeah. And in particular, what the church has said in its teaching office through this compendium of social doctrine, they've just mentioned a few very tantalizing things, but one of them is that the nation and the people are not synonymous, that a nation can include many peoples, that a people can exist without a nation. And it's really doing a sort of phenomenological work. Scary big word. All I mean is it's thinking about the thing itself, like in what ways can we use that word nation, can we use that word people, in what ways can we not? And it's realizing these are different things. And it's also grounding it by giving a priority to the people over and against the nation. Mm-hmm. I don't mean that they're at war, at odds intrinsically, but there's an awareness in Catholic social teaching that the people might not be served by this organizational unit we call the nation, but could actually be hurt or oppressed or otherwise subordinated, contrary to their nature as a people. They also say in this compendium that the people are, in some sense, the primary subject or the ear that hears the word of God as it's proclaimed. People receive this, and so that there's a relationship between the proclamation of Christian truth to a people that isn't quite the same thing as what we mean now by a modern nation. And that's actually, that might sound vague, but it's actually, I think, extremely important, because if the goal of all politics is ultimately the conversion of the world into the church, then the question of who is it that receives this call to conversion, and who is it that incorporates it into humanity, and by doing so incorporates humanity into the church, is an extremely relevant question. Mm-hmm. It's often a concern that seems to rise up to the surface in debates concerning integralism, where the nation, considered as this organizing principle of people, is also considered as the proper object to promulgate or otherwise be Christian. Whereas for the church, it seems that the proper subject of Christianity is the people, and the nation serves that movement or makes it more difficult, something like that.
And to summarize, when we say, so first of all, saying that the church is the people of God, but there are many peoples that make up this one people. In the last two books you read from Joseph Cardinal Ratzinger, the meaning of Christian brotherhood and the unity of the nations, I think we've really developed an idea that how can you have many peoples that then make up a people of God? And it's through, as Ratzinger says, becoming a new creation in Christ through baptism, and really seeing the other peoples as your brothers. And so there is a more fundamental unity than the just natural unity of your people. And with Renan here, he's showing us that the nation as a concept bears a similarity to what we mean by people, but really is different. Like, his argument is that the nation is not the people, and like you brought up with the compendium, can compose many people. So then the question is, what is the source of unity and identity of the subject with the nation?
Yeah, totally.
And that's his investigation here. And
one of the first things he says is that, and I think he says a lot of good things here as well, which is why I think it's stimulating to thought to read this guy, because he frustrates as well as pleases. But he says that it's essential to a nation to be involved in error, to be involved in forgetting, historical error. And the reason he says this is, he has a few reasons for saying this, but the most fundamental is that a nation seems to be comprised of people who've forgotten their own origins. And I think there's a truth here, right? So like, if you just think about what it means to belong to a nation, to belong to America, for instance, it is not, it is an experience of being plunged into something and having a general positive regard for it, especially in its past. That's certainly true, just as a description of belonging to a nation. It is not the result of research, right? So it's not like you belong more and more to a nation the more and more you understand profoundly its history and what everyone did to make the nation exist, etc. It doesn't have this one-to-one sort of not comparison. It doesn't come from historical research. In fact, Renan says that history is inimical to a nation, that what history tends to do is bring up the violence, he says brutality, with which unity is established, the unity of a nation. And that's obviously also true. I mean, I think you can see it in a sort of interesting way right now that's maybe not so helpful to start with. But, obviously there's a thing in America, and there's a thing in every nation. It's a tension between a glorious past and then a form of historical research that would undermine the glorious past, right? So in America, we're very familiar with this. We have the glory of America, the founding fathers as a sort of enlightened and ultimately Christian elite who were also the righteous rebels against tyranny. And then we have a undermining historical research that looks both at the founding fathers, about the sins of the nation, about slavery, etc., and undermines that glorious past in a way that's inimical to the nation. So the experience of growing up American is basically receiving your nation as a hero story, but then also receiving the undermining of that hero story, and then the result being a sort of tension that politically comes up when people say things like, well, we should just basically teach people the propaganda in order to have a strong nation, and not.
Well, I mean, that was the development of public schools,
right?
It was for that purpose,
right? Exactly.
And actually, you can see as well that, let's say first generation immigrants to America remember their past as being a different people now in a new nation, and part of that is forgetting and being incorporated into, now I'm part of the American people. And by the second and third, they've forgotten more about their previous origin, and their people which they belong in this other way. And in the same way, you don't identify with the pre-Constitution colonial era America, right? You say that's a prelude to the founding of our nation, and then from that point on, there's a source of unity that you look back to.
Yeah, and you'll notice that this makes the nation right from the beginning distinct from the idea of the people, because the people can exist without a sort of explicit founding event, right? You find yourself in your people, like you find yourself there, you know them.
Right, and Renan says that nations are very recent, and in fact, he says there are many different. He begins with saying there are diverse groupings of peoples out there. The forms of human society are of the greatest variety. He talks about the great agglomerations of men in the fashion of China or of Egypt, the tribes such as the Hebrews and the Arabs, the city-states of the Athenian and Spartan models. I mean, and then we have nations like France and England and Russia. And how did we get here, basically? And then there are confederations, he says, of different, Switzerland and America, great families and races. But why is it that we have nations now? And what makes them different than other groupings of peoples? But because we're in nation states, and that kind of seems like the thing, we imagine a one-to-one of what our people is with what the nation is. Yeah. And he's trying to pull at that.
Yeah. And that idea of unity established through forgetting a violent origin is interesting, because it's precisely what Augustine says about Rome and about pagan structures of power more generally in his City of God. That, first of all, there's this presumption that unity is only ever established violently, which we might think of as Hobbesian, or you might go back farther and call it pagan. But it is the great despair of both modernity and paganism that you can only ever have peace through war. You can only ever have plenitude and unity and communion insofar as you establish it through blood sacrifice, essentially. We share that with our Roman forefathers in that way. Augustine brings up in his City of God the ways that the Romans attempt to establish a glorious past through very intentional acts of forgetting. So he brings up Romulus, the founder of Rome, who of course famously killed his brother and established the city. And he shows the ways in which the Roman people are encouraged to forget about the violence of their forefather and for encouraged to worship Romulus as a god. And of course, this tracks with the Book of Wisdom, with the Hebrew Bible's analysis of all idolatry, that there is an intentional effort to divinize dead kings in order to create a unity of a common and blessed origin amongst the actual Romans. And what's fascinating is that Augustine is a Roman, and he is a Roman who has been afflicted, as it were, with Christianity, and now is demanding that his Roman brethren remember their origins as shameful and as sinful. And his idea is not because he thinks that there should be no unity amongst the Romans. In fact, quite the opposite. He is longing for a deeper communion to be the order of the day. But there's a different movement in history when it comes to Christianity and really Judaism, which is the remembering of origins. So if you have, generally in the construction of sort of unities that began in violence, you have a will to forget. And let me back up a little bit here. We always want to forget our sins. And we always want to forget the sins of our fathers. This is apparent in your life. And so there's an extrapolation to the life of the nation that I think has total continuity. It's not like some magic trick. Total continuity with personal life. It's like, if you're not willing to deal with your sin, so you did something terrible, what do? Well, you have to forget it. And you forget it by telling yourself stories about it that aren't true, right? If you're not willing to do penance, if you're not willing to look at the people you hurt and say, I'm sorry, then inevitably, psychologically, you're going to create a mythic structure. You're going to say, okay, well, I was allowed to do that because I have some sort of special case. You're going to start to, the beginnings of divinization are there. I am not like other men. I had this special case, which allowed me to do this thing, which I thought was so terrible, but upon reflection, I realized really I couldn't have done otherwise. You start to characterize the sin as inevitable, as flowing from essences and not from your deliberate choice, et cetera, et cetera. So we all know the process of idolatry and divinization. It's what we do with every sin prior to confessing and doing penance. And Augustine is saying, well, this is just clearly in nations. It's the structural version of the personal sin, namely that a nation starts to tell itself, okay, no, yes, there was a murder, but perhaps the one who was murdered really was not innocent, but this was an act of justice. René Girard is obviously the other Frenchman who considers this. And instead of saying, yes, we just achieve unity by sort of forgetting our origins, and isn't that lovely, says the reason for all the myths and the similarities between myths from all peoples is because we are founded on violent origins, and we are deliberately trying to lie about them. And Christianity is the force that says, stop lying. It says, remember your origin. So you can see this in the scriptures right away, where like, you look at the Jewish story of origins. So besides the fact that it proclaims that there's one God and that all people come from Adam, so that it all automatically makes the division into the nations something secondary, or division into people something secondary. It's very apparent that Adam is not great. I mean, this is the funny thing about being Christian is that you in America is that you're like, George Washington, great. Adam, the father of all, a jerk. It's like your relationship to your founding father in Christianity and Judaism is one of participation in his sin. Like, you're in Adam and you suffer that. You suffer the effects of his disobedience to God. And the whole story that's told is of the failure of the father, the failure of the founding father. And then it's liturgically remembered and confessed. And throughout the life of the Jewish people and then into Christianity, we're still doing the same thing. I mean, the doctrine of original sin is the doctrine that it always disables us from having a glorious past and of being a glorious people from a blessed beginning. Like, we are always involved in a critique, as it were, not our own critique, but God's critique of humanity that we take on. throughout the Christian, as the form of the Christian religion. I mean, it is, despite efforts to be cheery, it is a penitential religion. That is part of it. Okay, all of which is to say, for Augustine, when he's looking at these claims to glorious unity, he's just saying, as opposed to forget, he's saying, remember Romulus, remember the fratricide, remember the rape of the Sabine women, etc. This can remind us, I think, of a sort of ressentiment fueled thing where you pick at the glorious founders because you don't have their power, right? This is sort of how Nietzsche would analyze the situation. Mm-hmm. But I don't think that quite does it justice. I think rather there's a effort to found, for Augustine, is an effort to found peoples in the truth. So he doesn't see this kind of either or that Renan points out, like either you forget your origins or you don't have the unity of the nation, because Augustine has like a third way. He has the church. He says, okay, we're not constrained to either forget and so have a glorious past, or just become dissolved because we can't bear the shame of coming from fratricide and rape and violence. But instead, there's a way of penance. There's a way of incorporating our past and doing penance for it into something greater. Mm-hmm. That's the new thing that Augustine says is possible to the Romans. And so throughout the City of God, he's not critiquing them just to make them ashamed of themselves. It's constantly a call to repentance. Right. To becoming Christian, to be Roman now on this new basis.
Mm-hmm. And I think in a kinder reading of what Renan means by forgetting, I think that's right. I think in another sense of forgetting, there is an element of this is just how you construct the idol. So is part of, in order to actually make the idol work, in order to make the nation a spiritual principle, as Renan talks about, that you place beyond all the other gods and everyone's willing to sacrifice to it, you have to go, like, forgetting is part of that mechanism in which something human becomes divine. Mm-hmm. Something that really, in its origins, is like Romulus and Remus. It's Romulus jumping over the wall and killing his brother, the rape of the Sabine women. That actually being your origin. Forgetting is the mechanism by which the elites have to take what would be more of a folk people's mythology and make it into a nation-building idol, right? You have to, instead of the people remembering all these different, these myths where the heroes are confused with villains, the good are in the bad, there's all of it together. You have to like essentialize it, spiritualize it, forget it, and to the point where it's purified and divine, and then that can actually be the source of taking disparate peoples and then putting them into your mechanism of nation building. Yeah. Right? Like, so in a sense, the forgetting, the doing penance side of it for the sins of the past, but also a mechanism by which you spiritualize and divinize the principle of the nation. Mm-hmm. Something you're willing to sacrifice to.
Yeah, because ultimately it's not a because men are men, and so men are funny and failures. They're ultimately not worthy of our sacrifice, just on the face of it. Mm-hmm. But that's what's great about Christianity, I think, is that it allows you to be humorous. Like, there's nothing humorous about national origin stories. It's all just grotesquely romanticized, and everyone's perfect. Mm-hmm. There's nothing funny about the apotheosis of Washington or something. That's not. Yeah. It's like the least funny thing I can imagine. But there's something very funny about like folk traditions of the fathers, because they retain the sense of human idiocy.
Well, there's an example in Genesis of that type of forgetting for nation building, which would be when Joseph basically saves the Egyptians by saving them from famine, and then generations later a pharaoh rose who forgot Joseph. Yeah. Because in order to make it, to have your people and your mythology dependent on the intervention of the outside, of other peoples and their God, that doesn't help in your centralization of your power over your own people.
Yeah.
And so you have to forget, like, you can't keep telling the story about how good old Joseph and the Israelites, like, well, one of the Israelites, the good old Joseph helped you, and this other people is really, and then you have a brotherhood with them.
Yeah.
No, you have to, in order to establish the nation, you have to forget about all that and then talk about Pharaoh and our gods, and then the ancestors being divine and Pharaoh being the representative of that.
Oh, and there's plenty of stories, at least from the rabbis, of Joseph not just being forgotten, but becoming a god to the Egyptians.
Oh, wow.
So he gets kind of incorporated into their pantheon, as it were.
Oh, and now he's an Egyptian and not a...
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know the truth of that, but it is evidence of the kind of thing that the Jewish people are basically trained in Torah to think. So, like, for instance, another story of Abraham being, pretty much all of their patriarchs have these rabbinical stories of people trying to worship them as gods, and them refusing that worship, and that being part of what retains their holiness. And there's a truth that's being pointed out there, regardless of whether it's true that hordes of people lifted up Abraham onto a dais and tried to worship him on the plains of Shinar, which is one of their stories. The refusal to be worshipped, which is in Scripture when Joseph and his brothers kneel before him after he's saved Egypt, and he says, "Stand up. Am I a god? Am I God to you? No." This refusal to be a god is the crucial difference, I think, that Judeo-Christianity, if we can put it like that, brings into the world. That it's actively, it's worthy of honor and worthy of praise to resist the first beginnings of the national myth-making machine, right? To say, sorry, I'm just a man. Yep. So ever after, you're going to either remember this story in which I explicitly deny my divinity, or you're going to successfully forget it. Okay, so I think the idea of a divine origins is obviously confusing because we don't. In our modern nations, we're not explicit about it. Like, we would all agree, and the Frenchmen of the 19th century would all agree, that they are not setting up a new god. They're not setting up a new idol. But what Renan says is that what the nation is a process of forgetting that dissolves all the differences because you don't know where you're from and you don't know how you got there, and then the willingness to sacrifice for the sake of that thing, of that common belonging. And that does seem to be, regardless of what we say about it, so we might say this is all secular still, right? But regardless of what we say about it, the willingness to offer up your blood and to die for something is obviously productive of a spiritual unity that does not need to defend itself by particularities of place or of language or of race. It can overcome any idea of being a particular people because blood has been spilt for this thing. Mm-hmm. It's a fascinating way of doing it because it's almost like reverse engineering it. What do I mean? Well, you will, generally speaking, be willing to die for your family. And it is noble and heroic to die for your people, to understand yourself as giving your life for these others whom you love, right? No greater love has man than this, than that he laid down his life for his friends. But there's an order there, right? So the love comes first, and the sacrifice exists because of the love, and so the sacrifice is always a sign of the love that preceded it, of the unity that preceded it. So you die because of the unity between you and your sons and your daughters, you and your friends, et cetera, et cetera. And so love comes first. And so you can imagine that unity existing in reality, even if the call to sacrifice never happened, right? Even if there was never sin, humanity differentiated itself over time into peoples on the basis of love, there would be a technical willingness to give your life for the other, even if there was no threat of death, right? You can imagine that whole world. Well, in nation building, it becomes reversed, which is namely, let's spill the blood first in order to get the unity second.
Yeah. Right.
So let's... now, you can sometimes experience this in America in its own way in our general support of the troops, right? Where there's something unpatriotic about questioning America and the way that this is given as a critique is that you remember the sacrifices that the troops made for your freedom, even if that's not directly established. Like, how did they win my freedom? It's not a direct argument. It's an argument that essentially says, shut up, look at the blood. The blood's been spilled. And it's impossible, I think, for humanity to imagine a useless spilling of blood. So there's an immediate effort to say, okay, if the sacrifice has been already made, then the unity must exist, because that's how I experience my family. That's how I experience my people. That's how I experience my friends. The loves in my life would all indicate that if someone has given up their blood for this thing, then the thing is not just real, but substantially real. Like, it must be as real as I'll get out. That's where I think there's this fundamental, you might call it the inversion, but it was really the norm of
exactly
human grouping prior to.
And this is what, in a large part, I got from Renan about the nation, that the nation exists in a parasitical mining of the loves of a people. So because the nation being made out of multiple people, because he says, it's not to be confused with race or with language or whatever, because there are many other groupings of people that aren't really according to the grouping of a nation. And what he'll say is that the nation is a spiritual principle that you are willing to sacrifice to, and that it has a heroic past of great men who have made sacrifices in the past to establish you in the present, that now you are willing to make sacrifices for in the future. Now, and like you're saying, with they spilled their blood, therefore our unity. And so there is this, it's a type of, and actually I was talking to Andrew Jones about this, and he sees it as a prelude, really, to World War I. And I actually think it's a good analogy with this text, because this was written in the late 1800s. Yeah. So by that time, the hundreds of thousands of troops who are on the trenches on either side of each other in the great battles, in Passchendaele, for example, who jump out of the trenches to run at each other. For what? For the nation, right? Like, for the nation of France. They could have been from Burgundy or Nice or wherever, and now they're just, they're fighting, right? And they're dying, and they're spilling the blood. And in the doing of that, the nation which controls the people who are then becoming the troops has now, like, the elites who run that structure, right? Because the hidden thing here is the spiritual principle's fake, right? Like, Renan is not, he doesn't believe in this, he doesn't believe in some ethereal realm and transcendentals. He says, let's get rid of metaphysics and theology and transcendentals, but it's a spiritual principle. And what he's saying is the spilling of the blood and the sacrifices then establish the elites who control the nation as having their authority and their power over the peoples. Like, when your son dies in the war against Germany, you are now fully, you've made the sacrifice that makes you part of the nation. Right? And when all those troops do that in World War I, like, those nations are firmly established and will not change.
As a spiritual principle. Absolutely, because to say otherwise is to make the death of your friends and family and your people useless, or otherwise, which it's not. Because, I mean, as you pointed out, and I think has been pointed out before, like, there is a, if you talk to any vets who've been involved in America's foreign wars, where there's a certain dubiousness, you might say, of what we're doing, why we're here. It's obvious that there's a difference between what the troops are experiencing and then what's made out of what they do. So they'll talk about sacrificing for their brothers in the ranks. So so it's not to say, like, well, their sacrifices are at all diminishable. In fact, they're more glorious because they're done for love. I mean, at the end of the day, very few people now, especially if you think about, like, Afghanistan, are giving their lives for the spiritual principle of America. Like, explicitly, they're talking about doing it for my buddy.
Exactly.
And they're willing to to do that, because that's how people, like, that's what's best about people.
And that's why I say the nation is mining the
Right.
loves of the people, because exactly that. You really only die for your brothers around you, and in defense of your country, but like you're protecting the people who are with you, and your family particularly too as well. And so, but what is the leaders of the nation take with the sacrifices? They always say he died for the spiritual principle of whatever country, like this happens in France too, and everywhere that's really established a nation. You talk about the national heroes, even though in each of those cases, more proximately, they actually died for their brothers and their family.
Yeah. And I think that idea of mining is important, because a mine is taking a resource that's finite, right? And so the danger is that if you create cynicism, which I think is essentially what America, through its forever war policy and the industrial military complex that basically profited off of always having a war, it's created a profound cynicism in our veterans, in our veteran class, and really just our soldiers. The difficulty being that historically, that's when you have to start relying on mercenaries, and making your own army mercenary in structure, because you can't rely on belief anymore, which, as I think you're arguing, was not the case in World War I. World War I was like maybe the opening of the mine, as it were. Like, it's the first.
Oh yeah. In a certain sense, the opening of the mine, and as that mine, it requires a lot of, for example, like Foucault's work, where he goes through the development of the schools and military discipline, and it requires discipline and sacrifices from the people through strategic things in order to actually have them associate and sacrifice to the spiritual principle. So you need them to, you need these disparate peoples to be all a part of it. Right? Like, if you're going to say the nation is a spiritual principle, as Renan says here, that you sacrifice to, then who's running the spiritual principle? There's some elite running the spiritual principle, of which they have peoples in a certain border that they need to galvanize to be part of this nation building thing. It could be you do marches, you sell war bonds, you talk about our great heroic past or mythology. It could be you establish structures that build up the national spirit in people. It could be, you have to do all that. Otherwise, they just go back to being people, different peoples.
Totally.
Not really a unified machine of a nation.
Yeah, I mean,
who's willing to sacrifice everything for it.
Yeah,
I mean, you think of like North Korea or something too, right?
Sure.
Like, that's all they do all the time, is make sure that everyone's sacrificing to the spiritual principle of being North Korean.
How do you think Christianity then would operate? So I'm trying to think if the best thing to do is think about the kingdoms of the Middle Ages, or if the best thing to do is to not think about anything but the effect of Christianity, maybe as expressed in people like Augustine, who are looking at this process of forgetting, and then of a sort of disciplinary regime by which people are made ready to sacrifice to something that ultimately keeps the elite in power, by enabling them to to essentially just point to a flag or point to the nation, and presume its existence as the thing to sacrifice for, without having to prove it themselves. So for instance, what it strikes me that the forms of warfare obviously change in the nation building period, where prior to it, and I'm leaping around a bit, but there's obviously this one very apparent change, which is that the leaders of armies used to fight with them. So like kings would ride to battle with the troops they have mustered up, versus the sort of technocratic war machine whereby men are ordered to sacrifice by people who do not risk their lives, right? But command. So that's the new structure. World War One is obviously a turning point. So there were some. I'm sorry that I don't know them, but there were some battles led by kings in World War One, like who went with their men. But that was the end. That was it. And even then, it was not common. Surprising,
right?
So one thing that you can see is like, well, the idea of warfare changed. So you can say a lot of things about medieval warfare, but it would be very hard to argue that it was sacrifice for a spiritual principle or that it was getting that good. I mean, this is what's funny about our take on the Middle Ages generally, right? Where it's supposed to be a horrible time where everyone somehow is always fighting and at war, unlike our enlightened time where we just like send people to this buzzsaw of slaughter in the world wars, and somehow we still escape from having done that with the like sense of being superior to our past. But I think there's something to it all, that when you look at the Christian age and its fighting, I think what is so distasteful is that it's genuinely brawling. Like it is fighting. There's not really this attempt to make something real through blood. It doesn't really come up. It's a lot of like, it's a lot of squabbling. I'm not trying to be light about it. Like people died. People did give their lives. There was sacrifice for friends, for kingdom, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not. Yeah. So I'm I'm on a knife edge here of description. But the point is that.
Well, I think there's a fascination with the fact that there were more humane modes of warfare prior to what we're at now. I think it's even like Civil War reenactment battles and stuff. Yeah. Like imagine we all line up together. And we like get a drum and then we shoot a musket, right? Like, can we imagine a more humane warfare than that? Instead of, let's say in Russia right now where they have little plastic, like explosive mines that they push through rivers and then it blows up people's legs. Yeah. That's warfare today. Yeah, totally. Right? Like, but you got a lance and you ride a horse and, you know, there's a brawl, humane type of warfare that's
one of the critiques
still going on. It's like we look at that, it's barbaric. It's like, have you paid attention to what's going on now?
One of the critiques of the knights was that they were always just getting ransoms for each other on the battlefield. So it's like you'd be fighting and then someone would get you good and you'd be like, whoa, I'll pay you not to kill me. But that was actually respected because there's this presumption of a certain peace that's greater than the warfare of Christian peoples. So yeah, they're fighting, but they are kind of governed by something greater than themselves, which is the church. It's not to say that the fighting was all good. A lot of it was unjust, there's no doubt. A lot of it was cruel. A lot of it had ambition. A lot of it, I mean, there's all of that. But I think what's absent is the idea of like the deliberate manufacturing of a unity. And I think the presence of the king in the battle shows this in some ways, because if a king is willing to risk his life, so the one who's the ruler, the one thing you know is that that he is sincere about the fight. He might be totally wrong-headed and piggish about it, but he wants to fight, right? The general who commands other people to die, you can no longer presume that. Now, you can say all of it through propaganda, and they do all the time. But actually going and risking the bullet is the only real proof that it's not a way of getting something for the people who are not fighting. I mean, that's right. That's obviously the proof, is that the king fights with you, is that that you're doing it as a people, that you're doing it as a unity, and not that a unity is being established from something that is not otherwise a unity. And I think without that, it's always going to be a way for the elite to produce unity in our hearts, basically, is to have a war. It's to have a war that's commanded and that people die for, but doesn't actually involve the people who command it, the people who profit from it. It's sort of, they all stand back.
And the sacrifice isn't optional, right? Like, once the national mechanism begins, you can't you can't have objectors, right? Like you can't actually have people who get outside of it. Like you have to have it affect everyone. Everyone has to sacrifice. I mean, even like the German and Russian front at a certain point, they were just pulling in conscripts and conscripts. People would like try to flee the lines. They just immediately get shot by their officers and stuff like that. Like they would behind with guns, you go, right? Like, and everyone has to be wrapped up in it. Everyone has to sacrifice to the spiritual principle. There's not like an option of it. And just another point I want to bring up here to go back to the Middle Ages. Renan says unity is always brutally established, right? It goes back to the, what we were discussing earlier with, but he can't imagine in his treatment of the Middle Ages, it's just terrible, but he can't imagine that the unity. So why didn't medieval Europe splinter into nation states that fought each other in the medieval times? Well, it's because I think the unity that they had was one of Christian brotherhood with the other peoples. And the principle of unity was not a spiritual principle of sacrificing to a machine, to the spiritualized principle of over a people. It in fact was they were actually living as the people of God in their particular peoples. And so he talks about the Treaty of Verdun, where Charlemagne's sons, split up what will eventually, like Germany and France and these areas, in Italy. But why didn't those turn around and become nations that fight each other? Like, why could the territories be redrawn? Well, I think because they actually had a principle of unity that wasn't a nation. The principle of unity was Christianity. And so if the borders are redrawn, fine. If I have a different lord now, okay, that's great, whatever. This king now owns my territory and fought over here, okay. But there's no national mechanism of a spiritual principle that you sacrifice to. That's present in the medieval ages. So their unity is not actually brutally established.
It's not brutally established. It's also why Renan can't understand the presence of multiple peoples within the kingdoms of the Middle Ages. It's like he presumes they must have all forgotten in the way that he's prescribing the forgetting of origins, that the people of the Middle Ages must have also forgotten that they're really from all these diverse places. But what he doesn't allow for is the possibility that those things are subordinated to, they don't matter that as much within Christianity, because what matters in some way primarily is that you're a Christian. Like to find that you look different or that you are different than someone else within the church just doesn't have as much significance. And that's why the thing that the church needs to deal with concerning the Middle Ages and do penance for is not its relationship between Christians, but like its relationship to the Jews. Like the outsides of the church are marked by belonging to the church or not belonging to the church. It's really not who your great-great-grandfather was and like what. I mean, that doesn't even really come up in a significant way until the project of nation building, where race is utilized as a mechanism for the production of national states. Because if you think about it, nations which are produced through the heavy lifting of centralized powers, of public education, of maintained impermeable borders, of standing armies, of the destruction of any local difference within a given nation, and the production of, the national anthems, the national flags, the national rituals. I mean, this is all a lot of work to get all of the diverse loyalties to sort of fade, and the one loyalty, you are a German, you are a Frenchman, you are an American even, that takes a lot of work. And the what was I going with that? The in the Middle Ages, it just wasn't like I said, it wasn't as important, these differences, but when you get to nation building, you do have the same problem that Renan notes about the Middle Ages, which is that there are still these sort of memories of being different, even in the kind of sameness that has been established. So race becomes utilized, especially in the 20th century, as a way of sort of scientifically creating unity that maps on to what's already existing as a national project. It's like for the Germans, there needs to be a principle that really thoroughly dissolves, however dubious the actual science is. The effect of it needs to be to dissolve whatever lingering loyalties and differences from this one thing, the German nation. Whatever remains that isn't a devotion to this thing has to become suspect. And so what you see is the effort to really assert a commonality of origins, of blood in a given people that is utilized for national projects, you know.
And it can be variable, like what you utilize to build a nation project. So for the Germans, race, right? But there can be many different ways to reaching the spiritual principle of the nation. It depends on the people you're mining from, right? There's a lot of like historical revisionism going on in the right regarding World War II and trying to find good guys and bad guys and whatever. But the thing that's common to them is that they're all using something that their people loves, something that their people feels attached to, and then bringing it into a machine of the nation and saying to sacrifice to that, right? And so your peoples can love different things. Americans can love being free, and so we'll sacrifice to the nation to be free. Germans may, whatever, their superiority, the Russians for their motherland and whatever, Englishmen for, I don't know, something else.
Whatever they love.
Yeah, whatever they love. But so actually Renan is very helpful here because he's showing you there are many different ways to make sacrifice to the nations. It's not, so he says like nations don't flow just out of race. They don't flow just out of language. They don't flow. But he's like listing all the things you can use to mine from the people to build your nation. Right? All things that people, geography, right, is another one. Yeah. And it's actually very interesting. At the very end of this, I just wrote paganism, 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 no. Because this is a lot of what Andrew Jones and I were going through, the politics of paganism, that we could put it in subsidiarity and sovereignty terms too. There are many things that people love and are attached to. Different peoples love different things that then produce themselves in cultures and languages and friendships and all this type of stuff. And in the nation building project, there is a taking of those things, making people sacrifice them to a higher principle, which some elite run, and then utilizing it for whatever project. And it's the construction of the sacrificial machinery that is how nations as nations form out of disparate peoples with different loves, with different languages, with whatever. So,
well, maybe we could wrap up a little here, and I hope this is all very, very helpful and stimulating to thought for diving in further to the question of peoples by kind of distinguishing it, I think, from the national project, because in our language, those two words often do serve as replacements for each other. And I don't mean like in an illicit way. It's like I was thinking of the Bible. Our dominant translations will go from peoples to nations, without seemingly rhyme or reason sometimes. I was thinking about the canticle of Simeon, the Lord, now let your servant go in peace. Your word has been fulfilled. My own eyes have seen the salvation with which that you have showed in the face or in front of every people's, a light to reveal you to the nations. So like it's already
we hold both there. Yeah.
So I'm not trying to play linguistic games, but to see, well, there's a phenomenon that produces unity out of blood sacrifice, and there's a phenomenon where the unity is established out of love. And the former is parasitic upon the latter. And having that in mind, I think, would help us to understand what it means to belong to a people in a way that isn't necessarily tied up in a national project, even though literally, historically, it is tied up in a national project. I think in some ways this is the drama going on in America right now, that with Trump, the problem we're having is that the whole industrial military complex was pretty well established to keep us at war forever in order to keep the unity of the nation strong over and against other nations who are doing the same sort of thing. This was the neoconservative, neoliberal sort of end game, end of history. This is what we're going to do forever. And so I think part of the agony of Trump is that we describe it in these low-level terms, like he's disrupting the post-war order and such. But I think part of the agony is that he is humiliating the nationalist thing while using all of its language, if that makes sense. Like, we are to not be involved in wars is his general foreign policy take.
And what he talks about those is people are dying.
And the uselessness of it.
Right.
So he has in that sense.
It has a great use for nation building, right? Like, people dying. But if you're saying people are dying uselessly and saying it doesn't seem towards at least as Renan is defining it, a nation building project, right?
Totally. It doesn't serve it. And there's a way that Trump always sounds a lot like Pope Francis and really just the Vatican generally, because the Vatican as the teaching body of the church is looking at wars, and its primary assertion is that war is evil. It's not, which sounds really basic, but I'm sorry, it sounds really basic to say that war should be avoided, that war is bad. And then you have Trump doing the same thing, where it's like when it comes to it, his foreign policy seems to be like, well, let's just not have war, let's not do this useless thing. And I think we all know at some level that that's a Catholic position that is inimical to the way that we've structured our nations and the way that nations exist. And so part of the agony, I think, is that you can't have your cake and eat it too. So you can't have America without blood sacrifice. And that seems to be what's being suggested in the Trump regime, is that we can have America, but without the forever war, without the spiritual principle. And in some ways, it's very grotesque, because I think he arrives at it from almost like a businessman's, where he's like, well, what's the utility here? There's something in that sense very different than the Vatican's. I'm not trying to unite them. But there is this, I don't know what he knows, but he seems to have a willful ignorance of the utility of war in the production of unity. And I don't think he knows much, because sometimes he'll just say, well, I don't know, maybe he's more clever. I have no idea. But he sometimes will say things that rally the troops in the old-fashioned way, like let's nuke these people or whatever if they do X, Y, or Z. I mean, there's all of that. But then his actual policy seems to be, essentially more isolationist. And then the terror of it is from the actual managers of the regime of the post-war who know that if there isn't sort of consent among nations to all keep their boundaries, then a isolationist position terrifies them, right?
Yep.
Because other nations aren't going to be so isolationist in the absence. This is how the logic goes of the neoconservative foreign policy. Like in the absence of a strong American empire, then there's just going to be some other empire. Those are the only options.
Isn't it really surprising? Like if you didn't know what the contemporary present was, that the 20th century ended up here. Like you would think that it would just be this nation-building project, nations fighting each other, developing a bomb, and then the world ends, right?
Yeah.
There seems to be just the fact that we're here, I think, just shows that this nation-building sacrificial project, which the 20th century went down, all the way through.
Totally.
That this parasitical relationship on the people that, God's still bringing us through, and that the people in their loves, it goes back to Andrew Jones's The Priority of Peace. It really is that there is a priority of peace of which this sacrificial, spiritual, national principle is taking from and is trying to establish itself and the elite over the people. And so it's surprising that that order is somewhat crumbling. The machine is smaller and is starting to break in different places, right? Even with all the different political ideas that are out there, for a national project, you've got to have one political idea, which is our nation and its greatness. But the plurality of ideas about how the political order should be, the spiritual principle is not a singular idol that everyone's worshiping anymore. And so it's very interesting.
Interesting times.
Yeah.
Yes. We'll see. We'll see if the trappings of nationalism can be utilized to serve the people that they've otherwise been parasitic on. I mean, this is the sort of reversal that I think we're seeing, where it's like, obviously the flags of the nations have been put in place in order to embody the spiritual ideals and sort of shortcut to a person towards sacrifice. But it doesn't mean that the love of our brothers and sisters, our countrymen, is not, in fact, mediated through these nationalistic tools, such as flags and our love for the troops, etc. So the question is, can the latter serve the former? Can all of this investment that's essentially taken away from people's love of friends and utilize it for an end, can it remain, but not as something that hurts, but something that helps? Like, can I love my friends through the flag? Can I love my friends through? I don't know. This is sort of where I see why I think it's such an interesting time, is that it's not just like there's a whole-scale national penance and people are saying like, well, let's give up on this national project. But it is like a lot of people are saying, well, can we have all of these symbols without the actual blood sacrifice? Can we have all of these songs and feelings and the structures we've built up without it being ordered towards a forever war that continuously produces a unity that doesn't derive from the people, but is parasitic on the people? I don't know.
I don't know either.
I think that's about the time that we're living in, though.
Yeah.
Says Mark. Yeah. All right, folks. Thanks so much for listening. And we are going to be reading one more book prior to our conference. We're going to be reading De Lubach's Catholicism. So get yourself a copy and read up. And this is, I think, is this available online?
Yeah, I printed it out online.
All right. So we'll help you find Renan's What is a Nation, and you can spend some time thinking about that with us as well. All right. We'll see you at the conference, everyone. Bye.